Okay, well, why don't we get started? My name is Gordon Hull. I'm the director of the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics here at UNC Charlotte, and I'm very happy to be welcoming everyone today to Kim Hall's talk. I'll say more about that in just a minute. First, want to situate it. Kim's talk is the fourth in our series on disability this year. We've had talks by Rosemary Garland Thompson, Joel Michael Reynolds, and Ashley Shew previously in the series. The good news is all of those are now archived and up on the center's YouTube channel, so you can watch them if you miss them. To get there, for YouTube channels have really long, weird names, but the Ethics Center's website is ethics.uncc.edu, and there's a little YouTube button up on the upper right where you can click that, and it'll take you to the channel. This talk will also be up on that site as well. Should also say that we did a fairly substantial series this year on models for minority participation, particularly community minority participation in institutional research. Speakers for that one included Omega Wilson, Nikita Shilroll, Max Liboron up at the University in Canada. Those talks are also all up on the YouTube channel. I'd encourage you to see them. For those of you who are on an academic calendar, you know that the spring semester is winding down, and this actually is the center's last sort of talk this year. We're not entirely sure what programming will look like next year. We're going to try hard to keep some of the Zoom accessibility going. We also very much like to be face-to-face. Topically, we're assuming the funding for this comes through, try to put together a series on bias and artificial intelligence. The tendency, for example, for machine learning, biometric systems, facial recognition systems, not to recognize dark skin, particularly dark skinned women. And there's all sorts of stuff like that that's coming out of the AI research. So there's some real structural bias and discrimination issues that are well worth looking at. In any case, we'll be posting information about center events for next year up on the website as we have them. We'd love for everybody to follow us. We have Facebook and Instagram pages that you can also, and there's an email list as well. So please do stay in touch even as we head into the summer. So Kim Q Hall is a professor of philosophy at App State University up in Boone, and it is my great pleasure to welcome her here today. The talk is called Cultivating Ableism, and I've been excited about this title since I first heard it. So Kim, all yours.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your excitement, and thanks everyone for being here. I know it's hard to, you know, be participating in many Zoom events, but I truly appreciate you being here. This is a new project, and so I welcome thoughts and comments, questions, of course. Also, you know, if you think there are things I should look at, things I should read, I would appreciate that too. Thanks to UNC Charlotte's Center for Professional and Applied Ethics and for the Chancellor's Office. This paper, what I'm hoping to do in it is to reframe how we think about gardens, how gardens have appeared within philosophy, but also how we might think of a cryptology of gardens by thinking about institutionalized lives of gardens. And in particular, I'm going to be looking at gardens within nursing homes. The paper will have essentially 4 parts, looking at the garden in philosophy, thinking about nursing homes and the kinds of spaces that nursing homes are. How do we think, given those 2 spaces, about the institutionalized life of gardens and nursing homes? And how might we think toward a cryptology? So cultivating ableism on the institutional life of gardens. I begin here with a quote from Jackie Wang's Carceral Capitalism. What do we make of the flowering vine that uses as its trellis the walls of a prison? To think about disabilities environments is, at least in part, to think about where disabled people live. And in the US, that requires grappling with the reality of institutionalization. In the US today, many disabled people either live in institutions like prisons, group homes, and nursing homes, or live with what Liat Ben Moshe has called the institution yet to come, an experience shaped by the institutional bias that conceives institutionalization as a solution to the problem of disability, and means that disabled people live with the possibility of being institutionalized at some future point. Ben-Moshe argues that disability justice must be responsive to carceral logic that shapes the treatment of all people deemed abnormal and unwanted, including disabled people, and must aim to decarcerate disability by transforming society's conception and responses to difference so that disability is not conceived as a burden or problem for which some form of incarceration is a solution. Thinking about disabilities environments also entails grappling with an ableist conception of nature that defines disability as unnatural and as a result understands nature as a space where disabled people don't belong. Alison Kafer argues for feminist queer crip environmentalism that unearths and troubles ableist assumptions that inform mainstream environmental discourse about what nature and the environment are. Following Kafer, disabled body minds are a critical resource for a crip environmentalist reconception of nature and the environment. In my remarks today, I build on the work of disability studies scholars to outline some of the connections between environmental and disability justice and to identify some features of a crip ecology. Within a crip ecological framework, the nature of institutions and the institutionalized life of nature are interconnected features of disabilities environments in an ableist society. My contention is that nursing home gardens, like nursing homes themselves, are carceral spaces. Cultivating justice rather than ableism in the garden requires reckoning with the institutional life of the garden, an aspect of the garden that has been ignored in romanticized conceptions of gardens and gardening as inspiring virtue, health, and sustainability. My focus is on the ableist and carceral logic underlying the institutional life of gardens, not on individual experiences of gardens. I'm not suggesting that nursing home residents should be deprived of access to gardens. Indeed, for many residents, family members, and staff, a facility's garden can offer a welcome reprieve from the indoor life of the institution, as well as opportunities for pleasure, solitude, and beauty in an institutional space that provides precious little, if any, of those things. The quality of care and the welfare of those who are institutionalized is a crucial part of disability justice. That said, a disability justice movement oriented toward decarcerating disability aims to transform assumptions about disability and the treatment of the treatment of disabled people, their care, not merely reform carceral spaces where those who are deemed disposable are warehoused. Despite the fact that many family members do everything they can to ensure that loved ones in nursing homes are well cared for, the COVID-19 pandemic, perhaps especially its trajectory in the US, has underscored what disability justice advocates have long known: the depths of societal indifference toward nursing home residents and workers. No one wants to be forced to live in a nursing home. Regardless of the emphasis on home in nursing home marketing, nursing homes are not homes. They are places where people are forced to reside, denied privacy, and forced to participate in various activities deemed to be for their own good. While for many, gardens conjure images of human designed plots of land at private homes or in community spaces, gardens that are designed to be part of carceral spaces like prisons and nursing homes are as infrequently thought of as the people who do time, that is, who live and die there. The question is not, should there be gardens, but rather, what do these gardens themselves cultivate? Are these gardens aimed at sustaining or ending what Ben-Moshe calls the institutional industrial complex? Who or what is sustained by gardens in nursing homes, prisons, and other institutions of confinement? The philosopher's garden. The garden has long been conceived as a liminal space between human beings and non-human nature, heaven and earth, civilization and wilderness. Unlike the wilderness, gardens are a place where humans reside or are deemed to reside. Of course, wilderness is also a myth, but this paper is not really about wilderness. Gardens are a place where humans reside, where they engage in practices of cultivation to satisfy their own needs and desires for food and beauty. Within Western philosophy, the garden has been imagined as a place for the cultivation of virtue. For example, Angela Kollhoff and Maria Schumer present the garden as a site for the cultivation of environmental virtues like patience, humility, persistence, the capacity for enduring ambivalence, and caring for the other and the future. In the garden, they argue, the purpose of one's involvement with nature is to try to realize one's own ends. The luscious tomato or the beautiful bloom, for example. But nature always resists one's efforts in one way or another. As gardeners quickly learn, there is an ever-present possibility that human desires will be frustrated in the garden. As a Southerner, I dream all winter, spring, and a good chunk of the summer, because of where I live, of the homegrown tomatoes of my childhood, but try as I might, I have never been able to grow them. The soil, weather, and pests thwart me. And so I rely on folks who are more successful at growing them than I have been. For Kollhoff and Schumer, my resignation is an occasion to cultivate not tomatoes, but something of great environmental import, an appreciation of the realities of human finitude and the limitations presented by nature. While the garden is a place of human dwelling, good gardeners know it is not a place of anthropocentric control. Instead, the garden is a place of human nature interaction, to use Karen Barad's term for the co-constitutive, mutually transformative relationship between agents and the world with which they are engaged. A place where nature is worked with in ways that also transform our sense of ourselves. Thus understood, Kollhoff and Schumer contend that the garden enables the cultivation of environmental virtues that make possible an environmentalism beyond the impasse of the anthropocentric, ecocentric divide, an environmentalism cognizant of the fact that humans can't realize our own good if we destroy non-human nature. And to paraphrase ecofeminist Karen Warren, an environmentalism that fails to challenge the human nature binary is complete and inadequate. Incomplete and inadequate. Environmentalism must begin with human practices, human involvement, and human and more than human worlds. Gardens, Kollhoff and Schumer argue, are spaces where humans come to understand and appreciate their codependency with the non-human natural world. This realization is the occasion of what David Cooper calls unselfing, an abdication of one's selfish or self-centered desires. Importantly, for my purposes today, in these idealized conceptions of the garden and gardening, good gardening is theorized as the cultivation of care. As Kollhoff and Schumer explain, the care that is cultivated in the garden is the care for the other, the care that makes space for the other. For them, a caring attitude toward the more than human natural world is characterized by a practice of, quote, actively doing something to enhance and protect the others, e.g. a plant's own good, end quote. Wondering about why gardens have been, for the most part, under-theorized in philosophy, even though they make frequent appearances in philosophical texts, Dennis Schmidt also describes the garden as holding out a promise of the cultivation of care for that which one can never fully know or understand. Quote, one eventually comes to understand that the promise of the garden is a promise of cultivation, a cultivation of a form of care that defines the human relation to nature at its best. What one comes to understand is that gardens do not, as one hears so often, bring order to nature. Rather, they give order to our relation to nature, end quote. Ultimately, the care cultivated in the garden is a practice of self that undoes the self, that unselfs the self in its openness to a world that always exceeds efforts to control it. Or such is the ideal of the garden in Western philosophy, or what I will henceforth refer to as the philosopher's garden. Here, my reference to the philosopher's garden does not aim to universalize Western philosophy to all philosophical traditions. Instead, it is to mark a theme of how it appears in the mainstream of a philosophical tradition in which universalization is one of its prevailing modes. Despite its insistence that its conception of the garden and gardening are rooted in other than self realities of the world, the philosopher's garden still seems abstract, detached from material realities of self, the body, networks of care, and the lived world. For example, the philosopher's garden is a place where the gardener is an isolated individual, dreams and toils. And while this gardener is cultivating a relationship with other nature, this other nature is as abstract as the philosopher who cultivates there. Whatever the world is that unfolds in the philosopher's garden, it is certainly not the world of flesh and blood people, where they live, love, die, eat, breathe, suffer, and resist. As such, the philosopher's garden is a privatized domestic space of individual labor, a space of neoliberal imaginings that mystify what is really cultivated there. Gardening, as Lisa Heltke notes, can be a practice that removes one from others, as one seeks to keep others out and cultivate self-sufficiency in preparation for the end of the world, for example, stocking one's bomb shelter. We might also wonder about the relationship between gardens and unselfing practices of care. Gardens have been recruited into militarism and nationalism, as exemplified by the Victory Gardens in the US during World War II. Such gardens were presented as practices of support for one's country and the war effort. Far from opening the self to transformation through caring relations with as yet unknown others, these gardens presented opportunities to secure the nation against enemies within and without. As such, Victory Gardens were sites for the cultivation of self-sufficiency against threats, a practice of securitization against that deemed foreign. In fact, gardening involves identifying and excluding that which in the gardener's estimation does not belong: weeds, pests, and other invasions, for example. This, in fact, is a part of what we mean when we say something like the person is a good gardener. That is, the gardener must distinguish between the weeds and the plants they want to encourage. In her analysis of how words like foreign, invasive, and alien appear in the field of invasive biology, Banu Subramaniam writes, quote, "So long as the category of foreign species, whatever we may call it, exists in our own minds, it is still limited biologically, relationally, historically, and philosophically to a binary world of natives and aliens." The point is not only the xenophobia that permeates the term of invasion, as some have argued, but also the way natives and aliens are presented as a biologically and ecologically useful binary, end quote. Whatever openness to at least some others gardening may occasion, it also involves identifying and pulling the weeds, a term that, like alien or foreign, distinguishes between what does and doesn't belong in the garden. Koloff and Schumer would most likely acknowledge this practice of ferreting out what doesn't belong as part of gardening, but it is curious how these practices central to gardening, indeed to conceptions of good gardening, are not addressed in philosophical approaches that present the garden as a site where environmental virtue is cultivated. Given that some things appear in the garden are deemed disposable, how does gardening orient one to disposability? That is, to practices that not only make live, but also let or make die. Gardens can be sources of sustenance and delight for some, but they can also be sites of bio-necropolitical management of life and death. The philosopher's garden appears everywhere and nowhere, but gardens are rooted in place. And to understand gardens and what is cultivated there, it is necessary to understand where they are located, where and under what conditions gardening happens. Schmidt writes, quote, "What is ultimately at stake in the question of the garden is nothing less than our relation to the earth and to a world that we neither define nor control," end quote. If this is so, the question of the garden is nothing less than our relation to disability. To get a better sense of this, let's turn to what I'm calling the institutionalized life of gardens, by which I mean gardens that are incorporated into the physical and therapeutic architecture of carceral spaces, where people are contained, surveilled, managed, and controlled. For example, spaces like nursing homes, also known as long-term care facilities. So let's turn to the nursing home. What kind of home is the nursing home? The use of the word home to describe long-term care facilities is a euphemism that disguises a lucrative for-profit industry. Many people do not want to place loved ones in nursing homes, and their loved ones don't want to be placed there. And the cost of long-term care is out of reach for most people. According to Tia Powell, quote, "If you look up the average cost of a nursing home, you may find estimates of roughly $85,000 per year, but that is a deceptive number that typically reflects the rate that Medicaid pays. If you don't qualify for Medicaid or live in a higher cost area, you may face annual costs nearly twice that amount." A surprising number of people are under the impression that Medicaid pays for long-term care. It does not. For those without assets, Medicaid will cover costs, though not every nursing home welcomes the lower Medicaid fees. People in the middle, with some assets but not enough to cover the crushing financial burden of long-term care, can spend down their assets until they qualify for Medicaid, end quote. The estimated cost of a private room in a nursing home is $8,300 per month, or approximately $100,000 per year. Finding ways to cover the costs of long-term care, Powell explains, often results in financial trouble for partners, children, and others in a person's network of care. For most people in the US, the costs of long-term care are either completely beyond reach or not sustainable. There are currently 1.4 million nursing home residents in the US. Nursing homes are places where people in need of care who are deemed beyond cure are placed. Nursing homes themselves, as Powell points out, are moving away from long-term care because it's not as profitable as billing Medicare and Medicaid for shorter-term stays. As she explains, one of the worst situations for people with dementia, or really anyone, is to be in this cycle of being transferred back and forth from an ambulance to a hospital, to a nursing home, and then from a nursing home to an ambulance, to a hospital, and then back again. It's a cycle far too many nursing home residents and those who care for them know too well. Far from a home, the long-term care industry is a big business. As Liat Ben Moshe puts it, quote, "From the point of view of the institution industrial complex, disabled people are worth more to the gross domestic product when occupying institutional beds than they are in their own homes. Capitalism has found a solution to the problem of unproductiveness for those who are not perceived as laborers. Their bodies generate revenue when placed in institutional beds, such as large institutions, nursing homes, and some group homes, end quote. Meanwhile, those who do the labor of caring for nursing home residents are inadequately compensated for their labor. Whether they offer care in the home or in an institutional setting like a nursing home, the work of caring is devalued, and care laborers, most of whom are immigrants and women of color, are devalued. Nursing homes are sites where precarity is both exploited and reproduced. As Christina Crosby and Janet Jacobson point out, quote, precariousness overshadows care workers from first to last, end quote. Because many care workers enter care work to support themselves after escaping precarious situations, only to find the structure of care work itself to be precarious. While the word home signifies, for some at least, happiness and security, a place where one is welcome and valued, home for many is experienced as a fraught, ambivalent, and violent place, especially for those who are multiply marginalized. And Mariana Ortega writes brilliantly about home, really demystifying it and countering this nostalgic narrative of home, and also presenting what she calls a kind of home tactics, or making do, making the best of something, making a space for oneself when one doesn't feel at home, situated in multiple worlds, between multiple worlds. While precarious spaces for most residents and workers, the precarity is intense. While nursing homes are precarious spaces for most residents and workers, the precarity is intensified for queer and trans people who must navigate both cis heteronormative ideals that affect attitudes and perceptions of aging and social activities in nursing home settings, as well as homophobia and transphobia among residents and staff. Some gay and lesbian residents have gone back into the closet in the nursing home as a survival strategy. However, that strategy is unavailable to those who cannot pass. So what of the institutional life of gardens? Michel Foucault characterized nursing homes and gardens as heterotopias. Utopias, according to Foucault, are forms of emplacement that have no real place and are thus unreal. Heterotopias, by contrast, are, quote, real places, actual places, places that are designed into the very institution of society, which are sorts of realized utopias, the sorts of places that are outside all places, although they are actually localizable, end quote. Foucault characterizes what he calls old people homes and rest homes, that is, places where the elderly and infirm, or in other words, disabled people, are emplaced, as a sort of heterotopia that resides in the border between crisis heterotopias, which are places reserved for people in crisis in relation to society, and heterotopias of deviation, where people who deviate from societal norms are emplaced. Foucault writes, quote, these are the rest homes, the psychiatric hospitals. They are also, of course, the prisons, to which we should probably add old people's homes, which are on the borderline between the crisis heterotopia and the deviation heterotopia, since, after all, old age is a crisis and also a deviation, seeing that in our society, where leisure activity is the rule, idleness is a form of deviation, end quote. While Foucault singles out old age as uniquely poised between crisis and deviation, it's important to remember that long-term care facilities are places where younger people are too. It's also important to note that these days in the US, prisons are also nursing homes, a fact that highlights the substitutability of places shaped by the entwined, mutually reinforcing logics of ableism, racism, capitalism, and carcerality. Foucault's emphasis on idleness demonstrates that nursing homes, like psychiatric hospitals, are places where disabled people who need care and cannot meet societal norms of productivity are emplaced, where their so-called idle body minds can be made productive, even from the bed, as Ben Moshe said, or when emplaced near the garden. Gardens, according to Foucault, are heterotopias of contradiction, where unrelated emplacements are juxtaposed. The garden, he writes, quote, is a carpet in which the entire world attains its symbolic perfection, and the carpet is a kind of garden that moves through space. The garden is the smallest parcel of the world and the whole world at the same time. Since early antiquity, the garden has been a sort of blissful and universalizing heterotopia, hence our zoological gardens, end quote. But what does this characterization of heterotopias suggest about gardens that are themselves integrated into institutions like nursing homes? While nursing homes may be advertised as homey spaces where one's loved ones can live out the rest of their days with dignity, and the availability of gardens is advertised as part of this image, they are, like prisons, carceral spaces, dumping grounds for disabled people beyond cure. As Tia Powell puts it, quote, when a person appears to be beyond cure, medicine has a habit of losing interest. Incurable illness provides few research questions and nothing to add luster to an ambitious career. Cure gets the glory and the big bucks. Care is dull and unremitting, not scientific, not worth paying for, end quote. In an ableist context fixated on cure elimination of disability, places where those deemed beyond cure reside are places where disabled people with bodies and minds that can't be used as fodder for inspiration porn because they are deemed to have a degraded life, not worth living. As carceral spaces, nursing homes are spaces of confinement and disposability where treatment-resistant affects are managed. Within nursing homes, pharmaceuticals and activities are sites of affect management where what is being treated are affects that make residents difficult to manage, like agitation or depression. As Katie Albrecht and Janice Keefe point out, the routine use of chemical constraints raises serious concerns about informed consent in nursing home settings. In this context, nursing home gardens, I suggest, are another site of affect management, where ableism rather than just care are cultivated. Just as pharmaceuticals can bring about an anesthetized tranquility, nursing home gardens can function as what Rachel Carson called tranquilizing pills of half-truth that prevent questioning and reimagining how care and disability are understood and structured in an ableist society. So reimagining infrastructures of care toward a cripicology. And I'm getting this concept, as I'll explain later, infrastructures of care from Gina Kim. In her critique of ableist conceptions of nature and the environment, Alison Kafer emphasizes that nature, like buildings, roads, and cities, is a built environment, and like all built environments, is formed by oppression and assumptions about difference, ideas that also inform assumptions about what nature is or what or who belongs there. Gardens are also built environments that are designed to achieve specific aims. Within mainstream environmentalism, the garden has figured as romanticized liminal zone of human-nature interaction that offers opportunities to cultivate virtues along with their flowers, fruits, and vegetables. By contrast, nursing home gardens are designed to be therapeutic for othered body minds, a site of activities that, quote, complement traditional medical and social programs, end quote. Whatever individual delights or comfort they may occasion, nursing home gardens are also shaped by and cultivate ableism. Benefits of nursing home gardens noted in the literature on therapeutic landscapes include: 1, they reduce stress and improve mood, and 2, they enhance the eco-friendliness and sustainability of nursing homes, which is also a good selling point. In other words, nursing home gardens are designed to sustain the institution and achieve docility by managing affect, or put differently, by cultivating ableism. In The Rise of Cheap Nature, Jason Moore builds on the concept of oikos, the Greek root of ecology, to make a case for an ecology of oikos, a quote, creative, generative, and multi-layered relation of life-making of species and environments, end quote, informed by the understanding that, quote, human activity is environment making, end quote. Oikos means house or home, and an ecology of the oikos situates home and homemaking within the context of capitalism as central to an environmentalism concerned with the totality of the web of life, not as a force acting outside and against nature, but as a force that has relied on and produced cheap nature and cheap labor. Moore's insight about an ecology of oikos are useful for conceiving of a cryptology of the nursing home, an ecology that interrogates how ableism, racism, capitalism, and cis heteropatriarchy work to structure failed and even non-existent infrastructures of care in institutionalized and domestic spaces. Gina Kim introduces the concept of infrastructures of care as a part of environmental justice, and uses the concept to critique how environmental racism and ableism work together to shape state-sponsored infrastructures, and how it is that the failure of those state-sponsored infrastructures fail and rely on what she calls informal infrastructures of care. That is care that is necessitated by environmental racism and ableism. Kim's analysis draws attention to, quote, the slow violence of racialized disability, end quote, animated by state infrastructures that create obstacles for poor people and people of color to access care they need. Attending to the institutional life of gardens as a part of disabilities environments helps to outline and crystallize some features of a cryptology, and thinking about cryptology helps to think about how life and death are managed in the space of the nursing home. How it is that one might understand disability as a part of the web of life, and how to forge an environmentalism rooted in just care. So I want to conclude with a suggestion of some features of a cryptology. First, a cryptology is characterized by an expansive political conception of disability, the environment, and nature that seeks not analogies but lines of solidarity between disability or disabled and other people deemed abnormal, disposable, or unwanted in context of entangled, mutually reinforcing systems of oppression. Second, a cryptology critiques romanticized conceptions of nature that rely on and reinforce human nature and other binaries as standards against which others, like disabled and queer people, are deemed unnatural. Third, a queer ecology makes connections between disability, environmental, and other social justice movements that are informed by perspectives and experiences of those deemed unnatural, disposable, or who live in environments that are disabling because they are conceptualized as nowhere zones of disposability. And finally, a cryptology is oriented toward deinstitutionalization, a practice of resisting the normalization of institutionalization and creating modes of interaction, care, and living beyond violent forms of normalization. From a cryptological perspective, doing disability and environmental justice in the nursing home garden requires distinguishing between sustaining relationships and the well-being of residents and sustaining the institutional bias that normalizes carceral environments for disability. It requires attending to the formal and informal infrastructures of care that shape not only experiences of nursing home residents, but also generate the nursing home as part of an ableist future for disability. Thanks.
Thank you. So I think, why don't we have people manage their own Q&A here? And then I'll have to switch out. All right, now I have y'all in gallery view. Yeah, so if you want to either type questions in the chat or just unmute yourselves. Yeah, so Kennedy, you can start.
This is a really good, like, so many thoughts were running through my head. As you were talking, I'm not one who knows much about disability, but I'm learning as I'm hearing more thought on it. But immediately I went to the ecofeminist perspective. And as well, I thought as schools as an institutional guarding, and how it literally weeds out kids with like standardized testing, and how like sometimes with those standardized testing, I immediately thought to like kids of minority who like when I used to take standardized testing, it would give like stories in the language part where I'm like, this does not relate to my life. Like I've never heard of these words. I never thought in this way, but how like, I guess schools could be an institutional that it's a garden that kind of weeds out kids with the standardized testing that's usually geared towards a more like patriarchal society, to kind of put kids in the constrained or mastering or controlled type of environment. So that's what kind of came to my head. I just loved it. It was so many thoughts, and I kind of wanted you to know, what did you think about schools as an institutional garden?
I think you're spot on. I mean, I think for sure schools are also one of those institutionalized settings where there are gardens. I mean, there are schools that are promoting, placing gardens in the schools as part of educating students there. And, I think in order to, those gardens have been talked about in a fairly romanticized way in terms of teaching self-sufficiency. So when we think about, through growing your own food and feeding yourself, and also through an ableist rhetoric of really being a way to eliminate obesity, right? This problem of obesity and other kinds of disabilities in the population, right? So I think that for the most part, those gardens have been just talked about as these wonderful opportunities where people can learn how to cook, and they, if they live in say, for instance, in food deserts, that they would be introduced to various foods, and all that's good, but it comes with this ableist rhetoric also. And it is situated within this institution where there's a school to prison pipeline, and where there are, these ways, these processes of surveilling, controlling, and managing in very racialized, class ways, the affects of students who are there. So those things are true. And so I'm not talking about schools here, but I think schools would certainly be a site for this institutionalized, another site for the institutionalized life of gardens.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Ooh,
Okay, you should just unmute, or
I just saw in the chat that Robin James said, if I'm remembering correctly, didn't grades come to US education through agriculture? How interesting. I actually would love to have a resource on that.
I'll try to send you the paper.
Cool.
Yeah, I think I was asking about grades on Twitter one day, and some educational historian responded and said, here's this cool paper on how we got grades in schools through grades in agriculture. So yeah.
That is really interesting. I would love to see that. Thank you.
Hey, Kim, thank you so much for the talk.
Sure.
Fantastic, illuminating work. I stepped out for just a minute in the philosopher's garden section. So if I missed this, please let me know. I was interested in the relation between water and irrigation and resource, like thinking of resource management questions and gardens, because of course, like, you know, that relationship to the use of irrigation and water is, of course, very much connected to something like thinking through the lens of how water is used and who has access to clean water and where it's being used and what and for whom does a garden become an aesthetic practice as opposed to a necessity, and so on. And so I guess I was thinking also of the Water is Life movement coming from the Standing Rock Sioux, and thinking about some of the kind of indigenous resistance movements that are kind of thinking through the political relations to water. And I wondered whether there was a way of thinking a kind of critique of settler colonialism with respect to water resource and water management, also in relation to gardens and also institutional water management settings. So I guess that's not a clear question, but it's kind of related to the preservation of gardens and so on.
Yeah, no, that's really great and complex question. So I don't know if I can do it justice, but because I really haven't traced, you know, the water resource, but you're absolutely right that would be a part of really trying to think about the garden, not in this abstract way, but in its place and in a context of settler colonialism, to really look at, you know, where gardens are, but also, yes, how are these so-called resources really distributed and for whose benefit or not, and how that distribution is a part of a disabling, right, effect as well, in context of settler colonialism and racism. So I think, you know, I haven't looked at sort of thinking about water with nursing homes as much as I thought about how the therapeutic literature on gardens, but that's a really important point and good suggestion that I definitely want to follow up on. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm excited to see the continuation of your work.
I have another question about how does the practice of like genetically modifying things that exist in gardens, or just like the technology that we have, relate to disability in the gardens and nursing homes as well?
Oh, that's such a big question. Also, I mean, the thing that comes to mind, so a lot of these gardens, they're not really for food production, right? I think they're mostly places where they're kind of integrated into various kinds of therapeutic practices. So that's an activity like baking cookies, right? Which can also happen within nursing homes, where people sort of practice, you know, skills of just using their hands and you know, in planting and also enjoying flowers. For some residents with dementia, gardens seem to, so the literature says, have a calming effect, which is why I think about them in terms of affect management. I mean, we can also look at industrial food systems that supply these institutions. I don't think the institutional garden necessarily interrupts that, but if it did, you know, what difference would that make? That would be something to think about. But in terms of genetically modified organisms, in general, I mean, yeah, I think from a cryptological perspective, we would trace the discourse of purity, right? That informs this concern about genetically modified organisms. It would be really, I mean, I don't trace that out in this particular paper, although it is something I think to think about more. I would want to look at Maria Lugones's discussion on purity and impurity, but also Lisa Schwartzman's use of that in an essay that she wrote some years ago on genetically modified organisms and discourses of purity. So the way I would think about that from a cryptology perspective is to look at how it is that there is this emphasis on purity that informs a kind of panic about them.
So Kim, can I jump in with a small thought and then a bigger one? So the small one is that if you don't know Foucault's psychiatric power lectures, they might be really interesting here. So they're the year before the abnormals, I think. So early disciplinary power period, but after the heterotopias taught. And it has all this stuff about disciplinary power, but he also does a lot more of the spatial arrangements of the asylums than he does in Discipline and Punish or in the earlier stuff. And I'm pretty sure that at least some of the descriptions talk about like how they're meant to be situated in nature. I think the very opening description does, and it percolates here and there. And he also talks about the way doctors center themselves as a locus of care. And I think you could read up a marginalization of care workers out of that. There's a lot of stuff in there that I think would be like footnote level relevance here that might flesh out the Foucault stuff. So that's the small thing. The bigger one is, I wonder if there's a way to talk about this in the context of zoological gardens. And I just could not get out of my head the way Adorno talks about those in Minima Moralia, right? These places where, and you know, he ties it to fascism basically, as he does tie things to fascism. But there is a critical history, as I understand, of the way zoological gardens, you know, work to legitimate empire for Victorian England and Nazism and so forth. I wonder if there's a connection to be made here with that.
Yeah, I think so. Because and I appreciate also you giving me this reference to go and look at these other parts of Foucault, and I will look again at Adorno with this. But yeah, I think absolutely, because what stands out to me, I mean, it's true that while gardens are referenced, they're not really within philosophy. There are very few places where they're really sort of looked at in depth, right, for what they are. But when they are, as I tried to point out, like abstracted, and abstracted from how they are themselves, not only a reflection, say for instance, of empire, right, and other structures, but also places where those regimes are reproduced, in how they are organized, but also where they are situated, which for me, in terms of thinking about nursing homes, is important. What does it mean to have them there? I mean, there is the narrative, like, of course, it would be nice to have nice things to look at, but that's situated within a history of actually change within institutions, both psychiatric institutions, right, and these long-term care facilities, with involving access to the outside in care of residents through creating windows, right, for instance, but also establishing green places. So these spaces are also ways in which people are sort of moved through them, managed, right, through them. And I think that really hasn't been, as far as I can tell, really taken up in depth in terms of thinking about disability and institutions and the place of these gardens. So. And Gordon, would it be possible for me to ask you as host if you can maybe copy things from the chat and send them to me? So that might be useful. I know people are putting some things in the chat.
Yeah,
I can't look at it.
I even learned how to do that the other day. I might see if I can't recall in the next few minutes. Yeah, there we go. I think I can save it. Yeah, I believe it. Oops, not that way. I'll quit talking to myself and let someone else ask the question. That's okay. Not a good use of time, but I will figure out how to do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I noticed over here that there were more.
Kim, I have just kind of a really broad question. I don't want to get in the way of other people jumping in, but how did you decide to get started focusing on gardens? I'm just curious about the broader kind of backdrop. And then does this connect to a larger project, or is it just sort of standalone?
No, well, it might first be standalone, but it is connected to a larger project. I have to finish one larger project before going to that one. So it will probably first be standalone. But I want a project on crip ecologies. I have a piece on food, and this is a piece on gardens, and I have some other chapters in mind for that. But as I said, I have to finish the first one first. So I think two reasons, right, to answer your question. And one of them, it really begins with the nursing home. And that is just, I think like many folks with aging parents, I've had experiences with loved ones in and out of nursing homes recently. And, you know, something that stood out to me was someone who was there and was able to leave um, because of being there on a short-term basis right after surgery, so on. Was like, you know, yeah, please break me out of prison. I mean, that was sort of how it was described. And of course, I'd read Leah Ben Moshe's Decarcerating Disability and other works in disability studies, but I really wanted to think from the perspective of, you know, what's going on within this space. And so, and gardens for me, you know, in terms of environmentalism, they appear in these very romanticized ways. But gardens are really, and green spaces in general, and nice buildings and all of that. I mean, some of this is with schools, to go back to Kennedy's question too, like universities. It's really a marketing thing for family members as well. They want to know that they're placing folks in a good place. No, it's very stressful. But it, you know, it's really seems to me not so much from the perspective of folks who are there. It's really thinking about managing people outside and how they feel, but also the affects of people inside, all with an institutional aim. So I think I got there, one, because I'm working kind of incrementally on this project on crip ecologies, but then also just through those experiences. I also think, you know, like I said, as we think about the future for any of us, what are the networks of care that will sustain us? That will, and is, you know, what is our, we have this relationship as well to these institutions. So I think of that institution as a kind of place that is in the future, and how can we think about really cultivating justice as opposed to ableism there. So.
So we had a question in the chat. It says, I'm from Mary. She says, I'm a nursing home worker as a nurse in LNA in the past and a family member of nursing home residents. What are your suggestions as to how we can move through these spaces like nursing homes, thinking about this without despairing? And then she thinks she may have answered the question already. Mm-hmm. But I'll raise it anyway.
There's some interest. There's a great book. It's called Domesticating Disability. And there's a chapter in that book which is based on a lot of interviews with nursing home residents. And so there are a lot of things that are going on, right? On the one hand, you have folks who are in the nursing home who are really not able to participate as much, right, in various kinds of activities. And then you have folks who are more able, but what they're concerned about is how ableism even structures how residents differentiate themselves from others based on their ability to participate in activities as opposed to not. And so I think, you know, really thinking about how ableism circulates even in these contexts of institutionalized care, and trying to make room for other ways of valuing and caring for people there is a way to think about that, but also ultimately to support care such that these institutions aren't needed. I mean, I think that's the larger part of the social, you know, decarcerating disability. Why is the institution deemed to be the solution when people need care? And there's a lot of work within disability studies on that, and from looking at really supporting home health workers, you know, making sure that families who often, you know, are providing this care are themselves supported, that these institutions really leave a gap there in terms of what Gina Kim calls those informal infrastructures of care that try to fill in those gaps, but are themselves quite draining and exhausting. I mean, not only of financial resources, but just energy levels. But they are made necessary. And even though they enable, this is about, the series is about stories of survivability, they enable people to survive, and they aim to, you know, treat all people with dignity. They also are situated within these more, what Gina Kim calls formal state structures of care that actually don't, that actually make more precarious both people who work in them and also the ability of people to live with dignity.
I'm struck repeatedly by the nexus of, so I'm just, because I've also recent experience with this, the brochures invariably will picture happy elderly people in a garden, right? That's one of the stock images. So I'm really struck by the nexus between gardens and happiness as a form of ableism, right? The happiness management or something like that is kind of a neoliberal ableist technology. So it keeps coming up here in the conversation. I'm wondering if you wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think one of the things, again, going back to domesticating disability, in that text, you know, there's a discussion about how many residents sort of understand that it's not only that, one, you have this advertising, but they also understand that they need to perform certain affects and one of those affects has to do with a kind of affect of happiness or enjoyment with respect to a particular activity. That they understand that there's a kind of expectation that you know, performance of a certain kind of affect is something that places them in a category of healthier person than people who are more difficult to manage. And so there's a way in which that shapes how, at least in terms of the residents that were interviewed in that text, for that text, how they experience a nursing home setting. And this, you know, management of affects related to the garden, but also other kinds of activities. I should say there's a great book. It's called Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by Leah Lakshmi Piepsna Samarasana, who looks at how it is that queer and trans, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have organized as a part of disability justice networks of care. Because of, one, realizing these structures, the institutions aren't providing it, but really trying to think about how to care for each other in ways that resist ableism and racism and capitalism. So if folks are interested, I highly recommend that book.
Kennedy, you should just unmute yourself there.
Okay. I have a question. What about the people who don't physically have homes and they want to have access to home health care? Because my mom is actually a home health care nurse and I thought about going into nursing. So like, I'm thinking about like, okay, I guess that's one solution, but what do we do for the people who don't have physical homes? Because then essentially it'll start like a whole nother wave of an institution where those people go if we want to create care for them, right? Or I don't know.
Well, I mean, so when you're thinking about long-term care, again, we're thinking about, you know, first of all, needing to have Medicare or Medicaid, right, to cover expenses of it. But also, I think when you're thinking about, I think it's really important question about how to care for folks who aren't in home, because there are a lot of assumptions built into care. Janet Jacobson and Christina Crosby talk about this. Piepsna Samarasana talks about this. But the idea, first of all, that yes, one has a home, right? That's so much of how it is that these structures of care operate. But also that home, it comes with it this expectation that it is of a certain kind, right? So having people, assume perhaps that one is heterosexual, right? Assume that one is cisgender, or gender conforming. That these are assumptions. So when you let people into your home, there are a lot of people who are really reluctant to do that because in terms of the care provided, there's already this position of being vulnerable and with respect to someone coming into one's home. And so, there can be a reluctance, right, to really invite someone one doesn't know into one's home. And that's something that Piepsna Samarasana looks at in a really, I think, amazing way. But yeah, I think there's the assumption of home, there's an assumption of what kind of home and who lives there. All of those things are built into that, what Gina Kim calls infrastructure of care, that actually deny care to people who are marginalized, including people who don't have homes, who are homeless.
Thank you. Also, too, where could we find your work? Because I'm thinking about doing a film project over the summer. I'm a health and medical humanities minor, and so I feel like this will tie in really great with my project. And I would love to like reference some of your work and like talk with you about these.
Oh, I mean, I'm flattered. I would say this particular essay is not published yet. It's new, so it's in progress. And the comments I have here suggest there's more thinking for me to do about it, which is always good. But in terms of other work, I mean, library search. I have the piece on queer feminist politics of food was published in this journal, Philosophia. And so you can look in Philosophia, published in Hypatia. Dr. Sullivan just edited a collection on thinking the US South, and I'm honored to be in that too. So I would say if you do maybe a Google search or through your library, or look at the library database, you'd be able to find my work.
Thank you.
Thanks for your interest.
And so we're running near the end of our allocated time here. Does anybody else want to bring anything up? Okay, well, if that's the case, then why don't you join me in thanking Kim for her talk today. It's fascinating. I really, really enjoyed that. Got a lot out of it. So thank you for the talk and for your time.
Oh, thank you all so much. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kim.
Okay, well, I would say come to the next talk, but that means log on and find out when the next talk is next fall, and then you should come. It's required. All right, thanks everybody. Have a good weekend.
Bye, everyone.